Hello, I'm Paul Duncan McGarrity, a stand-up comedian and archaeologist. Now, I have been enjoying the latest series of Doctor Who, but on the New Year's Day episode, they wandered into my world when they cross-faded onto an archaeological site. Now, this isn't even close to the worst depiction of archaeology on TV. In fact, in a lot of ways, it was really quite good. They've clearly got someone on site who is telling them how to do certain things, and I will give them the wink and the nod to having used some of the correct terminology. But there were a couple of bits and bobs that were irksome. This, by the way, wasn't even the first time that archaeology has appeared on Doctor Who. Tomb of the Cybermen, The Demons and Battlefield all contain archaeology and archaeologists as main parts of their plot. Thanks, go to Mike Hall for that list. You magnificent nerd. The worst depiction of archaeology on TV, if you're interested, is Bone Kickers. Don't look it up, it's really not worth uncovering. Anyway, as I said, some things were a little bit irksome, and I am not one to pass up on the opportunity to turn something people love into an unrequested learning experience. So, here is my take on the archaeology of Doctor Who's resolution. Oh, and in case you haven't already guessed, you should turn off now if you want to avoid spoilers for the episode, the concept of stratigraphy, and the Industrial Revolution. Right, let's talk about dead bodies, specifically this dead body. The man on a mission who's cut down by an arrow in the opening section. Possibly for looking a bit too southern, the motives are unclear. Anyway, the poor bugger ends up face down with 100% too many arrows in his body. And there he remains, in exactly the same position for about a millennium. Until the archaeologists come along and do what archaeologists do. Clumsily unleash evil on the world, and they didn't even have to read any Latin this time. Now, we need to talk about deposition. Basically how something ends up in or on the ground. This can be deliberate, like burying chunks of alien body, or it could be accidental, like a rider face planting into a road. These aren't the only ways, but sod it? With deliberate deposition, the objects aren't going to be bothered by too many external factors. If the soil around them remains fairly stable and the chemical content of the soil isn't too destructive, then the objects can stay in place for centuries, if not longer. Certain materials do better in different kinds of soil condition. For example, if the ground is constantly wet, then organic material like bone or leather will survive better. Certainly better than soil that is being constantly drained, like something that has a high sand content. Our dead guy wasn't buried. He's found where he falls, but in reality that is what academics might call highly unlikely, which is professor talk for absolutely bloody not. That's a ridiculous thing to bring up, and I now think you're a pillock for even asking. There are a few problems. First off, the soil on which he falls appears to be compact and dry, meaning that he would likely be exposed to the elements for quite a while. By comparison, if he'd landed in marshes, then the loose, soft ground would have been more likely to cover the body as it sank down under its own weight. There are quite a few examples of bodies from bogs, but fair warning, before you go and do a Google image search, they look like creepy leather bags made of people. That made you want to go and look more, didn't it? Alright, hurry up, but come back. See what I mean? If the body is on the surface, it's going to be subjected to a lot more external forces, which is a really polite way of saying animals might eat it. This would likely scatter the remains and possibly remove some of the bones from the site of deposition. Weather such as wind and rain could also damage them, but probably most importantly, he has died on a road. It's a road that is used enough that the vegetation is worn away. A road which must have been busy enough for two robbers to think, we should hang out near that road and just shoot some random passerby. Yeah, that sounds like a plan. Which means either that what we have seen is by pure coincidence the last time that anyone chose to use that route, or everyone who has walked down that road subsequently has been like, is he okay?
Probably just drunk.
He's got an arrow in him.
Faking it for sympathy.
A dog just ran off with his arm.
Trained dog, fake arm made a sausage. Will you leave it alone?
For argument's sake, let's say that none of the above happens and our body remains completely untouched. Can it end up underground without anyone actually deliberately burying it? Well, possibly. Stratigraphy is the analysis of the order and position of layers of archaeological remains. These layers can form deliberate dumps like landfill from silt being laid down in floods, blown by the wind and so on. The oldest layers are at the bottom and the newest layers are at the top. When archaeologists dig a trench, we record the edges of them. We refer to them as sections. And we can see all of the layers and we can see how those layers interact with each other. And it gives us an idea of how the site has developed. Each of those layers is given a unique identifier, and this is called a context number, which, fair play to Doctor Who, they used correctly, so good work. Even if someone comes along later and digs a hole through all of the layers, and fills that hole in so that some of the new material is now physically lower than the older stuff, we can still see where the cut starts. And as such, we know that that cut has to be newer than the soil it is digging through. Some areas where material is being laid down, like towns, have been occupied for a long time. And as such, the level of stratigraphy is much deeper. For example, in parts of the city of London, which has been occupied since the 1st century, the stratigraphy is up to 9 metres deep. These are formed from demolition, rubbish dumps, floods, destruction layers from the Great Fire and the Blitz, and thousands of other activities and processes, both natural and man-made. As such, a coin lost in just a few inches of Roman mud can end up deep underground without ever having been deliberately buried. Going back to the location of the body then, we can see that it appears to be in a slight valley, which would have helped to build up a little bit of soil, but there's nothing nearby like a river, or there doesn't appear to be, which would have potentially dumped a lot more silt onto it, and there certainly isn't anything like a town nearby. The area around Sheffield, which is where this episode is taking place, and specifically underneath the town hall, has been home to human occupation for over 12,000 years. But it wasn't until the 12th century, with the construction of Sheffield Castle, that the city started to form in its current location. As such, the lack of any buildings makes sense. What doesn't make sense is when we return to modern day and we find our skeletal friend is now 7 to 8 metres below ground, using the people walking around as a rough guide, at the bottom of a Victorian covered reservoir. Aside from the fact that this is unlikely, but not impossible, that this amount of soil could have built up, let me tell you something about the Victorians. They were destructive buggers. The speed at which they developed the country was only matched by the sheer lack of sods they gave for the things that they were digging through. As archaeologists, we will often come across beautiful layers of stratigraphy which suddenly stop with a dirty Great Victorian construction cut straight through the middle of them. As such, the fact our fella has remained untouched by obviously massive building work all around him is nothing short of miraculous. Okay, Time for a quick speed round to get out some of the pettier points that I wish to make. This skeleton hasn't been laid out in an anatomical way. In fact, I'm pretty sure this bone is on the wrong side. UV light isn't used like this in archaeology. Ooh, cool 3D model of the reservoir. Hang on. If they are below ground, where is the protective equipment? Why are they working on a site on their own? I don't even have to ask, what if something bad happens to them? Something bad did happen to them. So that's it. Hopefully you've learned something about archaeology. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more, let me know. Subscribe to the channel, do all of that YouTubey stuff. You can follow me on Twitter at PaulDuncanMcG, or you can listen to my podcast, Ask an Archaeologist, where I answer questions and interview the unsung heroes of the heritage industry. All right, ta-ta for now. And if I don't see you before, I'll see you after. Bye-bye.